you know what it's like when you're around a person, all they want to do is talk about themselves. They're smarter. If you say, oh man, I saw the most beautiful flower bed the other day. And they're like, oh yeah, you know what? I've been to Amsterdam. Have you ever seen the flower beds there? Like everything is better, bigger, whatever it is. That's how you sound as a company when you're ego driven.
Welcome to the follow-up question. My name is Michael Ashford, and I am your host. Here on this show, on the follow-up question, I've set out to uncover amazing, insightful stories from people from all different backgrounds, all different perspectives, with a goal in mind that by hearing those different backgrounds and hearing those different perspectives, that we find a way, a better way, to find common ground. And I see my role, and I'm trying to teach you in your role out there in the world, that our job is to ask more questions, to be more inquisitive, to listen more. The more you are asking questions, the more you are listening. Because when you ask questions and you truly listen, you gain an insight into who someone is as a person, who they are as a human being, what drives them. And that's what I want to do here with this show. Do you ever get frustrated when you're trying to get someone to listen to your viewpoint? You ever been there? You ever been so frustrated because they're just not getting it? They're just not listening to your words. If they could just listen to you. My guest this week, Carla Johnson, says that that's one of the things that just kills a company. When you are so ego-driven that you just want to shake the consumer to understand your viewpoint rather than having the self-awareness to come at them with a story and invite them in and place them as the hero in the story. Carla is the author of the book Rethink Innovation. She's a consultant and a keynote speaker. She goes all over the place working with all different companies on how to get better at innovation and rethinking the way that they operate and do things. And while so much of what she does in her day-to-day life involves companies, so much of what she talks about here in this conversation with me can directly carry over to our everyday lives. And you will hear that time and time again. And speaking of finding common ground, as I said in the intro that this show is all about, it's amazing doing a show like this where you're interviewing people from all over the place, how much common ground you actually find. Carla and I discovered when we jumped on this call, we live just a few miles away from each other. We actually grew up one state away from each other. She in Nebraska, I in Kansas, both from small town Midwestern backgrounds, went into college and started in engineering before eventually moving away from that into different majors and different tracks. And now we both work on the marketing sort of world together, not together, but in that world for our full-time jobs. It's wild, just the common ground that you can find with so many people, and you just don't even know it until you start asking questions and dig in a little bit deeper. So that aside, all those commonalities, I love this conversation with Carla because we really get down to tackling how do you force out the ego? How do you get better at storytelling and bringing others along with them, whether it's in business or everyday conversation, bring them along to your ideas. How do you get someone to act? How do you motivate? How do you help them understand your story better? We tackle all of that and more in this conversation. Be sure to stick around to the end where I give you just a few brief thoughts from our conversation right at the end. And if you want my fully fledged out thoughts after I've had a week to consume the content a little bit more, sign up for the newsletter. The link is in the show notes. You can go to thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter and subscribe to The Follow-Up. It's my Friday newsletter that drops every week, Friday morning, where I expand on a key theme or key topic from that week's conversation. And this week, it just happens to be Carla Johnson. Enjoy this conversation, everyone. I'll be back to wrap things up at the end. I heard you in my research describe your small town in Nebraska as I believe you said small but culturally diverse. Can you just describe where you grew up and what life was like in that small town, Nebraska town?
Absolutely. So I grew up in a little town in Northeast Nebraska, right up in if you know your Midwest state geography, and the curve where South Dakota is to the north, Iowa's to the east, and right there, it's part of the area that Lewis and Clark explored when they did their grand expedition. And the name is Laurel. And when I grew up there, it had a population of 1,011 people. I think now it's waned to about 850 people, but it's a longtime heritage with my family. And in fact, the family farm has been in our family for about 120 years. And we have pictures of my great aunts and grandparents getting married there. And my dad was born and died in the same room. And it's just kind of a magical thing to have in this day and age, such a long connection to the land and into a specific place in town. And our kids are also very connected to Laurel. And I say culturally diverse. It was, I grew up around a lot of different Europeans. And my grandfather was Danish. He immigrated to the US when he was 14 in 1913. So I think I grew up with an ear for accents. And now as a traveler, I think that's something my mother really instilled in me, a curiosity about the world. It's easy for me to go from accent to accent and quickly get that ear and be able to understand what people have to say. So, it's to me in middle America, it felt culturally diverse. Now that would be different if we look at it by today's terms, but it was, it really did have a formative impact for me as to how I looked at the world and what felt like home, I guess.
What you've been away from the Midwest, not away, but you've not lived in the Midwest for quite some time now. What do you think most people get wrong about your Midwestern roots and where you came from?
I think most people underestimate the people in the Midwest because Midwesterners are very nice and friendly and kind. And I think there's this perception that nice guys finish last and that if you're smart, you're also ruthless. But I think you don't have to choose between being successful and being nice and kind. And in fact, it's funny. I've had people say to me that they find me to be a very nice person and they've waited for the other shoe to drop sometimes. And I'm like, it's just how I was raised. And it's just what even beyond that, I just believe that's the way I want to go through life. And I think there's so much about the Midwest that is really beautiful about the people and how they care for each other as a community. And also just the landscape of it. My family and we moved to Spain for a year. And came back right before COVID. But I taught for a university in Barcelona for about 6 months. And I would show them pictures of where I grew up. And they were just stunned by the beauty of it. And I think oftentimes other areas in the United States get a lot of the credit for being beautiful areas. And I think there's just such a simplicity in the beauty of the Midwest that often gets lost. And I'm sure you see that with the wheat fields of canvas and how it actually does look like amber waves of grain and all of those things that turned into such melodic phrases and stanzas.
How does a young woman from a population 1,000 town in Nebraska, in Northeast Nebraska, come to begin thinking about perpetual innovation and storytelling? Where were the roots and the seeds of that sown, to use kind of a Midwestern phrase there?
Yeah. And I think that I give that credit especially to my mother. She was a teacher for kindergarten and first graders, and she was very close to my grandfather. And here's this man who in her life was bigger than life itself often. And I think we all kind of had this fascination with where my grandfather came, and he would tell stories of Denmark, and there is a lot of similarities between the area that he grew up in Denmark and where he lived in Nebraska. other than the heat and humidity. I'll say that, but just like the rolling hills and the tall grasses, and it's very, very similar. And I think with my mom, she was a born teacher, like truly she was a teacher. And she talks about how her younger siblings were horrified in the summer because she would make them play school all summer long. And my uncles would say, oh, it was horrible. We'd get out of real school. And then here's big sister making us go play school in the corn crib. But I think what she instilled in us, because she was also an avid fan of history, is curiosity. And as I look at that, growing up in this little town, I was the youngest of 5, but all of my siblings and I are highly educated. And I think that comes from a desire for curiosity. And we're all kind of, I think, perpetual students of life. 5 kids hold 14 college degrees, and we're all extremely well traveled. And again, I think that comes from curiosity. And it's not that kind of travel that's always 5-star hotels and Michelin restaurants. There's my own kids can tell you the number of times we've slept on the floor in airports or train stations or wherever else, because the more money you spend when you travel, the more distance you put between you and the places that you are. And I think it's just that curiosity that kept leading me, from one area to another, and particularly through storytelling. And I think listening to my grandfather's stories, those stories of the other immigrants in the areas that I grew up, it was just, I was raised on stories. And I think when you start to look at how do you do something different, it's always a story. And I think innovation is its own type of story and story structure. And that's very different from how we really think of innovation, and how it should be very complex and big and disruptive. And that's part of my, mantra as we look at rethinking innovation is what's the story behind it, and why does it matter to people, and what's in it for them, and why should they want to be a part of it and believe that they, as individuals who might not have the degree or experience or, fill in the blank with anything else, that they too can be the innovators who can make a big difference and have a significant impact when they don't have those traditional innovative credentials behind their name.
What's a story from your grandfather that you just immediately go back to, that one when I ask that question rushes into your brain?
Oh, and it's beautiful because I've seen this exact place where he was, because we go back to the house where my grandfather grew up, is that he was largely raised by his grandparents. And both his grandmother and grandfather worked for a more wealthy landowner that probably was a mile or mile and a half away from the house that he grew up. And he talks about his grandfather taking him with him and walking down the little dirt path and crossing over into the wheat field and walking the path through that and over to this farm area where he would take care of the cattle and the horses and things. And part of it being in the cold Danish winters, the smell of walking into the stables of the animals and the warmth that he felt. And there's a little dock that was down in that area. So when he was done for the day in the summer, he'd go down there and he'd jump in the ocean essentially and take a swim and just the youthfulness and kind of the playfulness of his childhood when I only knew him as an adult.
What do you do now? And because I want to fill in the gaps between that and listening to your grandfather's story and growing up in the Midwest to what you're doing now and filling that in. How do you describe what it is that you do for your work, for your career now?
It took me a while to really boil it down, because I was always looking for labels like, excuse me, I'm a B2B marketer, I'm a content marketer, I'm a storyteller, all of those traditional labels that make other people comfortable about how we talk about the work that we do. But it's something that led to the title of my book. And I realized that when I looked at all the similarities throughout my career, where I was the most successful, had the most impact in a positive way on other people, when I felt the greatest joy and purpose in the work that I was doing, is that at its very foundation, the work that I do teaches people to rethink the work that they do and the impact that they can have. because I think it's the educator, the teacher in me that I inherited from my mother, is that I always believe people can learn how to do anything. And especially after I started to speak and publish some books, people would say to me, I could never do that. And I'm like, no, really, you can. Let's just rethink what you're doing now if this is the path that you want to take. And they start to see something that is a bigger world. They start to feel inspired. They start to feel some of these things that they felt were true as kids, but they were taught aren't appropriate anymore as you grow up and make your way into the real world. But it's things that really matter to them in their heart. And I think there is a really powerful way to blend those things that matter to you so much in your heart with the work that you do, whatever you may do. And this is the reason that we see things like people who are accountants who come home and you find out that they're amazing guitarists and play in a band or something like that. And I think there's things that you can take from these passions and apply them to the work that you do in a way that helps you rethink it. And then all of a sudden, maybe you're more relatable, maybe you're more joyful, maybe you're more inspiring. And that really does make a big difference in the impact that you can have, even if it's, just to one other person. Maybe it's the impact is on yourself and what you believe is possible in your life. Or, a lot of people, that's how they end up being leaders of their teams, because they're their own piece of evidence that you don't have to choose between what you love and what you do. And even if they feel significantly different, there is a way to blend pieces and parts. So you don't feel like you leave your soul at the door every day when you come to work, and you really can put more of your heart into what you do for a living every day.
Carla, you just mentioned that response that you get so often. Oh, I could never do that. Why do you feel we so often put that governor on ourselves, that we so often immediately, you mentioned the word label. Why do we assign that label to that situation so often?
Oh, I think it's our human nature that we compare the worst of ourselves with the best of somebody else. And that's why when people say, I could never speak like you do on stage, or I could, something like that, one of the things that I like to do is tell them the stories of when I was really, really horrible at something. So one, it makes them laugh, and then it's more relatable, because I'm sure their horrible was not that horrible. And, and to show them that you can do it. One is a choice. I mean, I made a choice consistently over time to really work on these things because they were things that mattered to me. And the other thing is that I guarantee that there are other skills, other talents that they have that I would look at and go, I could never do that. People who can sing, believe me, in the shower, in the car, you name it, I am, Whitney Houston or Beyonce. But as soon as somebody shows up, all that talent goes away. And so I do say, I could never sing like that. And, maybe I'd never be a Beyonce, but I don't have to be as bad as I am. But the difference is that's not what I choose to practice. I enjoy it and have fun, even though my family clearly doesn't enjoy my skill. But, it's something simple that brings me joy. Now, if I wanted to be good enough to, perform, I would take a different route. But, there's other things that are a different priority for me. So I think that's a hang up that we have as humans is not understanding that it's not that we're not good at things. It's that we have to make choices about where we spend our time and what we do. And somebody may be great at something that we feel awful at, but I guarantee we're also amazing at something else that somebody else is horrible at.
I got to hear one of the stories. What is one of those times where you bombed something?
Oh my gosh. I can tell you, I will never, ever forget this day. Like, I can still exactly remember everything I wore. I can remember everything about the detail of this room. And it was when I was starting to do speaking in workshops. And this was my first real workshop. And it was for a group here in Denver on content marketing. And I had all of the content prepared, meticulously prepared. But the group that put it on asked me to find a sponsor, help them out with that. And so one of my clients agreed to sponsor it. So they put several $1,000s behind this. And I wanted to make them look good. And I was so nervous. And I had like if you're into fabrics, women's clothing fabrics, Michael, I had like a darker teal blue tank top on, and then like a little jacket that went over, but it was kind of thin knit material, which shows perspiration like you wouldn't believe. And so I started to get nervous. And I'm up in front of this room, and I kind of happen to glance down, and I can see underneath my armpits, like the fabric's getting really dark because I'm sweating so hard. And then as soon as I noticed it, I like totally started sweating harder. And then, so then I'm trying to keep my arms next to, I mean, you can see what I'm doing. I'm trying to keep my arms next to the side of my body. So I don't like to, I am a big gesturer. So I do that so I don't raise my arms and everybody sees these big sweat stains. And then I feel like a T-Rex trying to, gesture, and just it just in my head, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And they sold 2 of them back to back. So then I had to repeat all this. And so between the first workshop and the second one, I went to a bathroom like 2 floors down from where this event was, because I didn't want to run into anybody in the bathroom, either from the previous one or the next one. And I had to put my jacket under the blow dryer to blow it dry to get rid of all the sweat stains. And then I put paper towels under my armpits, and I'm thinking, okay, this should be all right. So I get back up to the room. We start off and I'm starting to relax a little bit. And then it comes to my mind, what if I raise my arms really big and one of these paper towels falls out from my shirt? And the day couldn't get done fast enough. So I tell people that story when they think they're nervous. I'm like, well, have you ever done this? And I think somebody even said, oh my gosh, no, all I did was like fall down in front of everybody. I'm like, done that too. I used to do programs for a nonprofit, and I was walking up the stairs to do a Q&A with the audience, and I caught my foot and totally wiped out in front of everybody. So I'm like, after a while, you just have to own it, and we're all human. But I hope I never get that perspiration laden again in a workshop or an event or anything.
I can imagine.
Like that, so.
I can imagine. What you just described, comparing your worst to someone else's best, reminds me of something else that I came across in just preparing for this. You said our story is a small sliver of someone else's world. Can you describe why that's important for us to understand?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't remember what context I said that in, but when you only get a little slice of a story, it's kind of like the story about the people who are blindfolded and they're all touching a different part of the elephant, and they describe it as a completely different animal. It's the same thing. I mean, if you took let's say 3 different slices of my personal story now. One of them is that I've lived and worked on 5 different continents. That's a pretty big story. You take another slice. I grew up in a really rural town in Nebraska. I went to a 1-room country school through 6th grade. And, I'm the youngest of 5 kids on a farm family. That's another slice of a story, but very, very narrow. And then you think of another one about, it took me 9 years to get my 4-year degree in college, because I just, I had a lot of interests, and a lot of distractions. And so I started in engineering and I ended up with a master's in history. And I think when you only have a little slice of a story, it's our nature as the audience to fill in the rest of the story. And what we fill that story in with depends on our own personal background and experience and stories. So how you might fill in the rest of any of those stories, if that's all you knew about me, could be completely different from somebody who grew up in the Bronx in New York, or somebody who lived in Tokyo, because we all bring our stories to the greater stories. And it's one of the beautiful things, and I think also one of the dangers of storytelling, is how the story ends depends on where you end the story. And I think that's very true. And who also is the one who's retelling that story.
Is that how assumptions are made? Based on what you just said, that I'm taking a sliver of someone's life, applying what I know. Is that how we get into perhaps dangerous or wrong assumptions about people?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I read someplace that it was from a neuroscientist at Stanford who talked about the propensity of our thoughts. And I'm going to make this assumption that assumptions are also like they have a much higher tendency to be negative than positive. And so I think when we make these assumptions to fill in the story, I think there's plenty of times, we do things that have a negative connotation, even if it's, I'm not good enough compared to them. Instead of saying, this is amazing what this person has done. And what can I learn from how they've handled the situation, how they came up with this idea, how they've rethought something they're working on, and what can I learn from it? And I think that's why it's so beautiful when people do that, because they come to the process with a humble nature. And I think the ability to leave the big ego at the door. And I think that's a really incredible thing. And when I did research for my book, Rethink Innovation, that's one of the characteristics of people who were the most prolific and consistently prolific people, is that they were able to check that ego at the door, and they let curiosity and they let how their brain naturally connects different ideas and thoughts and experiences together. And that's naturally what led them to, down a path that they didn't necessarily intend to do, but turned out to be really, really valuable.
How do we do that, Carla? Is it a conscious decision? I'm going to leave my ego at the door and I'm going to get curious, or is it learned through experience? How do we do what you just said to be more curious and in these situations where innovation is required?
I think anytime you tell yourself you have to stop doing something and you have to start doing something else, you right there have made it so incredibly difficult and almost set yourself up for failure. I think there's very few people who have that fortitude or personal discipline to do that. And what I found works for the most successful isn't discipline, but rather self-awareness. And I tell you, that's something I feel that I will probably work on until the day I take my last breath. There's plenty of times as I've studied the connection between mindfulness and innovation that I've caught myself with the ego like pulsing going, I got to do this and it has to be this way. And the ability to stop and say, okay, why am I feeling this way? And what is it about, a situation I'm in, something else that am I particularly more stressed or tired or whatever? Being able to be more self-aware is a big first step of how you become more innovative, because when you become more self-aware, you become more observant of yourself. And then you start to make that connection between the observations of how you respond in a situation to the situation itself. And then you become more observant of the situation. And there's all sorts of research that shows that the more observant a person is, the more creative and innovative that they are. So, there's plenty of ego to go around, that's for sure. And there's plenty of ego that pushes through big innovations. But I just continue to ask myself, what if it wasn't so ego-driven? And what if it was based more on mindfulness and purpose and the impact that it has on people, perhaps more empathy and compassion. And I think that the interesting thing that we would find, is that, and I was talking to a chief marketing officer the other day, is that there's many people who say it's important to put people and purpose before profits. And he said, actually, if you walk into a board of directors meeting and say something like that, they'll get their pitchforks and torches and chase you out of the room. And that's the reality of the world that we're in. It does ultimately have to be about profits, because we have to keep the lights on and the doors open and people paid and things like that. But it's because profits do matter so much that we have to care about the purpose and we have to care about the people. And when you do that, it naturally lends itself to being more empathetic to the people. And that means they become more aware of their own situation. So it's almost like reverse engineering it in a way that we're not traditionally used to doing as business leaders, and thinking how we approach business. And I think that's probably been one of the biggest learnings that I've had from all of the travels that I've done, and seeing businesses all over the world, is seeing how other leaders, other companies in other parts of the world are able to do this successfully, and they don't have to make that choice.
I definitely want to come back to that, because that is actually in a note that I wrote of something I wanted to ask you. But you and I have a different connection besides just being from the Midwest. You started in engineering in college, I believe, and finished with a degree in writing and history. Is that correct?
History. Yeah, I have a master's in history.
I started as an engineering major in college and finished with a degree in mass communications and journalism, and went on to become a newspaper reporter. You talked a lot about self-awareness right there. What was it? Was there a moment? Was there something that made you aware that engineering is not me? This is not who I am. Because you do not strike me as an engineer. And I got to tell you personally, I could not be an engineer. More power to the people that are. I could not. It's not my personality. It doesn't seem like it's yours. What made you aware of that fact in your life?
Well, I think it ties a little bit into why I went into engineering in the first place. And I'm the youngest of 5 kids in my family, all very left-brained, analytical, amazing engineers, lawyers, military professionals. My sister, who's just 2 years older than I, she worked on the Star Wars program, and my brother's PhD dissertation proved that 3D faxing, which is 3D printing now, could be done. And another brother worked at the Pentagon and things like that. So I grew up in a family that looked at tangible degrees as essentially the path to safety. My dad I talked about my mom a little bit, but my dad was an accountant turned farmer. And, it was a time in the world when you went to college to study something so that you could get a job and stay at that job. And I remember telling my dad in high school, the last one at home, and I'm highly right-brained, that I wanted to study graphic arts, graphic design, and go to the Chicago Art Institute. And I, again, still remember that day, him putting down the newspaper at the dinner table and saying, like, who does that? How would you ever, who would ever hire you for that thing? But, you grow up in small town Midwest, I'm like, well, I guess I don't know. Okay, I guess I'll go be an engineer because I'm great at math and science, and that's what everybody else did. And, the first year wasn't too bad because I still like chemistry. I like physics. I'm not wild about math, but again, I was good at it. But the wheels fell off the bus because I was just like, there's so many cool things to look at and study and do. And I think my heart was always in writing. I've always, since I was a little kid, loved to write, and I think appreciate great writing. And it came to the point where it was a Saturday afternoon, and I knew to study for a test, I was going to have to spend this gorgeous Saturday all day in the library, studying for a calculus test or a physics test or, whatever the test of the week was. And that I knew it was never going to be any different than that. And I watched my older siblings and I saw how much time they spent in the library, and I wanted something more people oriented and more, I think, creative, more inquisitive, in a less linear, less constrained thinking kind of way to pursue. And, I ended up studying history because I had a college professor who was an amazing history teacher. And it was because he taught in stories. I look back on that now as because he taught through stories rather than dates and facts.
Did you at all do any of the reverse engineering that you just talked about a little bit ago of this is what I want the end to be like and work backwards? Did you do any of that, or was it going down the path of history because of that teacher's influence?
Oh, no, I totally flailed through the next, I don't know how many years. I ended up with a master's in history, but along the way, I got a job at an architecture firm. And that was truly serendipity because the reason I got the job is because I understood in the olden days, pre-CAD, how to draft. I could do that. And I could also write. So I could do some of the basic drafting and I could write proposals. And so that was my start into working in a situation where I think I was more of a translator between the technical things and the things that need to be told as a story. And so I worked in architecture and engineering for 10 years. But one of the beautiful things that I learned from that is learning from design architects, their process for designing a space. And when they look at what needs to be done, one of the first things the designers I worked with would start out to say is, what do we want people to feel when they come in this space? Because they were always public spaces, churches, performing arts places, hospitals. And those are all spaces that are hugely emotionally driven. Even when they do office complexes, it's like, how do we want people to feel when they come to work every day? And then they would reverse engineer that into the design that they would create. And so because I didn't have marketing classes, my influence about how I approached marketing came from understanding how to reverse engineer what I wanted the impact of something to be that I created, wrote a proposal, a marketing piece, or whatever it was, and then reverse engineered that into how it got created. So I think that was one of the best things that came from those 2 years of electrical engineering, was getting enough of the technical expertise to be able to understand the process deeply and then translate it in a way that made sense for me and how I approach the world. So without knowing it, I guess I was kind of learning some fundamental UX UI. We were definitely doing design thinking before IDEO ever came along. And that's really how I approach a lot of the work that I do.
Carla, then how do we take that approach to thinking about what is the emotion that I want to create? What is the end result? How do we do that in I'll call it a more snap judgment kind of way? We can't always in every situation sit back and walk through that process, right? Have you found ways to make that more manageable in daily life? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, and I'm going to use an example from business because you and I
Sure.
kind of both work in the same general area, is that, like, for instance, if you asked a marketing person, like, why are you creating this piece of content, or a salesperson, it's like, well, because we want people to buy our stuff, right? Well, it's, I call that kind of the no shit reason. If you can say something and people go, well, no shit, then you haven't really gotten to the root of it. And so we have to look deeper at, well, actually, no shit, you want people to buy your stuff, but what else do you want to happen because of it? And there's a story of people don't buy a hammer, or a quarter-inch nail, they buy the hole that it'll put in, that you can pound in the wall. But I say, actually, they don't. They don't buy the hammer or the nail for either of those reasons. They buy it because they want to hang a picture that they took of their family on the beach last summer, so that every time they walk by that hallway in the house, they have an amazing emotion and memory of, connection with their family. It just happens to be that's how they got it there. And so people still focus so much on the details of what they want people to know. And this goes back a little bit to ego versus self-awareness. We have to understand that our push to insist other people listen to what we have to say is the very thing that makes us lose their attention in the first place. And
Wait,
so if we
hold
can
on,
start
Carla,
out
can you say that
Go
again?
ahead.
That was so good. And I hardly ever interrupt my guests, but can you say that again?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the very thing that we want the most to happen is the thing that makes people ignore us the most. And you think, and oftentimes I explain this instead of, as a marketer, communicator in a company, or executive in a company and wanting to connect with their customers, to bring it back to, like, what it's like when you're around a person, all they want to do is talk about themselves. They're smarter. If you say, oh man, I saw the most beautiful flower bed the other day. And they're like, oh yeah, you know what? I've been to Amsterdam. Have you ever seen the flower beds there? Like, everything is better, bigger, whatever it is. That's how you sound as a company when you're ego driven. And nobody wants to be around that person, much less when we do get back to travel, have to sit right next to them in an airline, on an airplane. But we completely miss that disconnect when we're creating things for work, because without that sense of self-awareness, we keep the person we're trying to connect with the most at arm's length, and we're trying to be more formal. We're trying to be, oftentimes play into the boss's ego, because, I'm sure there's more than one listener who has had to do something because the boss said so when we know it's not right. But it's that ability to be self-aware about our role in our customer's world. And this goes back a little bit to your question about the little sliver of a story. And we as brands really are a little sliver of a story in our customers' whole day. It's our whole world, but it's just a small sliver of a story. So you think about, you and I probably both own cars. To the car company, it's everything. But to us, I could ride my bike, I could walk. Do I really need to take the car? Kind of thing. And all of a sudden, something that they're so certain matters so much to us actually doesn't. But they're only looking at a little sliver of our life and our story. And I think that's a big part that's ego driven. And when I work with companies to help them understand what a true customer journey is versus a much more specific buyer journey, it's really eye-opening for them to start to think about these things. Because one of the things I have them do is talk about, okay, tell me what happened during your day. And they go through the day, and I'll say, okay, now if you stop to get a cup of coffee, talk about that experience. And then to start to give them the context of, now, did you decide which route to take to work because of that cup of coffee that you bought? Did you decide where to go out to dinner because of that cup of coffee that you bought? And it sounds obnoxious and ridiculous. And I said, but that's how you approach how you're talking to your audience. And it's why you sound so ridiculous, because you're not really as important as you think you are. So you need to look at this from the perspective of your customer story and what really matters to them.
I know you're talking about business right now, and I know that's the work that you do, but Carla, so much of this extends out into our relationships, right? I mean, I had you repeat that because that is so true in our relationships and trying to find common ground right now. Mm-hmm. That when we just attack with what's most important to us, and we're only that sliver in that day of that person, you're going to push them away, right? I mean, it was profound when you said that, because of the extension into so many other areas of our lives. And I'd love for you to put this in business context, because I think it will apply to our everyday relationships as well. How do we fix that then? How do we approach those relationships, those interactions, less ego-driven, more intentional in bringing to the table what the customer wants? And certainly, or perhaps it's in an everyday conversation, what the other person wants or desires. How do we do that?
Mm-hmm. This is interesting, because I think I mentioned that I worked on, the workshop that I did that I sweated through.
Yeah.
That same group, we brought some amazing speakers to Denver, and it was such an incredible privilege, because one of them that we brought was Simon Sinek. And I call them airport lessons, because I was chair of the programming committee. And so I would always volunteer to drive to the airport and pick up the speaker and drive him to the hotel. And that was the best learning experience I ever could have had. So I picked up Simon Sinek from the airport and, chatting with him to downtown, and had dinner with him that night and the next day, and then gave him a ride back to the airport. And it was, I want to say 2011, 12, right around in that time when he was, some of the early years of Start With Why. And I was asking him some questions about things similar to what we're talking about now. I said, there are people in the world, groups of people who are so incredibly different. How do you get them to come together so that there isn't that constant conflict and all of the negativity. How do you find that common ground? Because in his talk, he talked about how he was working a great deal with the military and the leaders. And this is before his book, Leaders Eat Last, came out. And he said, if you really look at human nature and what matters to people, if you're only seeing conflict, then you're not getting it down to the lowest common denominator. So you and I, back to our engineering math, looking at the lowest common denominator, he said, and I think at the time he had been working with some troops who were stationed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he said, if you look at these two groups of people, whether it's a troop or some Afghan locals, he said, they all care about their family. They care about providing for their family. They care about safety. They care about, what they believe the vision of the future should be. And I think that we make things so much more complicated out of our own sense of maybe defense or proactive fear, that we're not able to bring it back to that self-awareness and say, I feel myself tensing up. I feel myself being defensive about something they didn't even say. And I think if we can stop and back up and do more to find common ground, because I think there is so much more that we have in common, like right now as a country, than we're letting ourselves see. And you don't help find common ground by trying to convince somebody else to see your point of view by calling them an idiot, by telling them they're stupid, ridiculous, and all the other things. I mean, I don't think I've ever been convinced to change my point of view when somebody says I'm an idiot for what I'm believing right now, so I don't think I'm alone in that thing. And I think that's one of the things, whether it's a political discussion, a business discussion, or, a dinner table discussion, is that we need to have that self-awareness to step back and listen to people.
Carla, what's something new that you've learned recently?
I have my family, they're like sick of hearing about this. I've been trying to learn how to shuffle dance from TikTok videos. And it's better. I'm better at it than I was at speaking in that workshop, but I'm sure not putting my own videos out there. I have this long-term vision of myself being an amazing, fun shuffle dancer, but I may need this pandemic to last several more years for that ever.
Nobody wants. I'm gonna just say it. Nobody wants that. So okay,
exactly. So I may just have to, cut my losses. But that's something I've been trying to learn. Something that's fun and a little bit physical, but not too much physical.
What's better, your singing or your shuffle dancing?
Oh, I'd have to say singing, just because I've had so many more years of practice. But I think my family would probably say my shuffle dancing, just because of the noise level.
That's hilarious. Carla, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your perspective here. Last question that I always love to ask of my guests is, what's something that you wish you were asked more?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think I wished people asked more, why do the stories that we tell ourselves matter so much? I think that's because every story we tell ourselves determines what we believe we can or can't do. And going back a little bit to the three slivers of stories that we talked about a few minutes ago, it's the story we have about ourselves depends on the elements of the story we choose to tell. So I could tell you Angela's Ashes type of sad story about growing up in this little town in rural Nebraska and not having much money and having to walk to a one-room schoolhouse and, all of these things. Or I could tell you the story of an amazing childhood full of freedom and laughter and community and things like that. And I, depending on which story I would choose to tell myself, really sets my life up for a completely different path. And it's not that whatever you've experienced in the past has to stay that way. I think you can look at your past and revisit it, and that can make a significant trajectory change in a very short amount of time, depending on what that story is. And sometimes it's talking with friends about, your story, people who knew you as you grew up, your family or whatever, because it was about 8 or 10 years ago, I went to Las Vegas for a girls' weekend with 5 of my closest high school girlfriends, and we hadn't all been together since high school. And it was we all talked about our impression of everybody in high school and our families and things. I'm like, really? That's what you thought? And it was really eye-opening. It was really eye-opening. And I think, the perceptions we have of ourselves are even more important than the ones that others have of us.
I was going to ask, is that why you intentionally say the stories we tell ourselves and not just the stories we tell?
Absolutely. Because the stories we tell ourselves make the difference in the stories that we tell.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Carla, thank you so much.
Thank you, my neighbor.
Yeah, right? Had no clue.
Crazy.
This has been fantastic. Again, thank you. How can people connect with you and keep in touch and follow along with your work?
My website is Carla with a C, Johnson.co. There's no M, just CO. And you can go there and find out about my new book, Rethink Innovation. I am on LinkedIn as well as Carla Johnson, Twitter, also Carla Johnson, and Instagram at carlajohnson.co.
I will link all that up in the show notes so people can have one-click access to it. But thank you so much. Enjoy that beautiful weather we're getting out here this week, and have a great time. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's gorgeous. Thank you so much for having me on. This was really, really a fun conversation.
Awesome. It was so good, I have to say it again. Our push to insist other people listen to what we have to say is the very thing that makes us lose their attention in the first place. Reflect on the power of those words and the truth that is in those words. When we look at the people who study debate and study arguments and disagreements and discourse, time after time after time, they say, argue for the other person's viewpoint. Argue in the way that they care about. Argue about the things that they care about most. And then you will begin to find common ground. They will listen more because they feel seen. Time and time again, we hear that, and it is just so powerful when it is said as beautifully as Carla just said it right there in that conversation, in that interview. So many thanks to Carla for sharing her story and her wisdom on the show this week. Please do me and Carla a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Carla that I have on each week, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me. Yes, it is truly me, Michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. And I say, yes, it is truly me. I don't have anyone answering my emails for me. I will answer you, provided you are not a bot or trying to sell me some Instagram follower package, right? With that being said, I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.